What if time is not a straight line but a loop, a fracture, a maze folding back into itself? What if the past is not truly past, and the future is not waiting ahead, but already leaning backward into the present, like a shadow cast before the object that made it? And what if the moment we learn to move through time is also the moment reality begins to come apart? Because time travel is not just a fantasy about machines and wormholes and distant futures. It is a wound in logic, a quiet tear in the fabric of cause and effect. The moment you allow the past to be revisited, changed, or influenced, the universe begins to ask impossible questions. Questions with no clean answer. Questions that fold in on themselves until reason starts to dissolve. Tonight we are going to drift through those questions, not quickly, not urgently, but slowly, calmly, as if descending into a dream built from contradiction, a place where effects can arrive before causes, where futures create their own pasts, and where one small decision can quietly unravel the entire cosmos. So settle in, and let us begin where all paradoxes begin, with time itself. Civilization rewrite. When most people imagine changing the past, they imagine something personal, a warning delivered, a mistake corrected, a loved one saved, a conversation redone, a single life bent gently away from tragedy. But time travel, if it ever existed, would not remain personal for long, because the moment history becomes editable, the scale of intervention begins to grow, from one person to one family, from one family to one city, from one city to one nation, and eventually from one nation to the entire structure of civilization itself. This is the paradox of civilization rewrite, not the paradox of changing one event, but of changing so much that the world which produced the traveler no longer exists in any recognizable form. At first, this may sound like the ordinary dream of progress. What if we could go back and prevent war, prevent slavery, prevent famine, prevent collapse, prevent empire, genocide, plague, dictatorship, ecological destruction? What if we could step into the early fractures of history and gently steer humanity towards something wiser, kinder, less violent? It is a deeply seductive idea. Perhaps one of the most seductive in all of speculative thought, because it turns time travel into a moral technology, a machine not just for curiosity, but for repair. And yet the deeper you follow that fantasy, the more unsettling it becomes, because civilization is not a simple structure with a few broken parts. It is a vast entangled system of language, trade, migration, violence, invention, geography, memory, belief, agriculture, disease, law, energy, myth, accident, and adaptation. Every institution, every border, every religion, every technology, every city, every cultural habit rests on a mountain of prior events, many of them terrible, many of them contingent, many of them inseparable from one another. And so the paradox emerges. How much of history can you improve before you no longer recognize the world you are trying to save? Imagine a traveler with extraordinary power and extraordinary certainty. They decide to intervene early, before one of history's great catastrophes unfolds. Perhaps they prevent a war that would have killed millions. At first, the result seems undeniably good. But wars, horrific as they are, also reshape borders, economies, alliances, technologies, migrations, and political systems. Prevent one major war and you do not merely save lives. You alter the entire downstream architecture of civilization. Different nations rise, different nations rise, different languages dominate, different inventions appear earlier or later, different families form, different people are born, different myths become central. Different fears organize public life, and within a few generations the world may be almost unrecognizable. This is not necessarily worse. It may be better in some ways, but it is no longer our history. It is another civilization entirely. That is where the emotional force of this paradox lies. Because we often imagine saving civilization as though civilization were a patient whose wounds can be cleaned, while preserving the identity of the body. But history may not work like medicine. It may work more like ecology. Remove one predator, one disease, one drought, one conquest, and the whole system shifts in unpredictable ways. You are not patching a broken wall. You are rewriting the soil. Take a moment to imagine the traveler returning home after centuries of carefully planned interventions. They expect relief, triumph, a healed world. And instead they arrive somewhere profoundly unfamiliar. The cities are different. The language has changed. The moral values are rearranged. The art, the religion, the technology, the architecture, the customs, the family structures, the food, the music, the political assumptions, all transformed by 1,000 altered currents. Perhaps the world is more peaceful. Perhaps it is less cruel, but it is not theirs. The traveler has not repaired their civilization. They have replaced it. There is something almost tragic in that. To save the future so thoroughly that you erase the world you meant to preserve. This is what makes civilization rewrite such a difficult paradox. It reveals that large-scale moral intervention may not be additive. It may be substitutive. You do not simply remove suffering and keep everything else. You create a new historical organism. And that raises an unbearable question. Do you have the right to redesign humanity, not merely to save lives in an emergency, but to reshape the entire trajectory of collective becoming according to your understanding of what should have been? That is an enormous burden, because the moment one traveler begins editing civilization, they are no longer just a rescuer. They are a curator of reality, a selector of futures, a private architect of human history. And no matter how noble their intentions, this is perilously close to becoming a kind of temporal authoritarianism. You decide which catastrophes are unacceptable, which revolutions should happen, which empires should fall earlier, which discoveries should arrive sooner, which beliefs should spread, which institutions should never form, and gradually, without ever meaning to, you become something very strange, a person imposing a civilization from outside its own lived emergence. That is chilling, because civilization is not only a machine to optimize, it is also the accumulated expression of billions of partial lives, including confusion, conflict, beauty, error, and unintended creation. To rewrite it from above may reduce suffering in some ways, but it may also flatten complexity into preference. And perhaps the most disturbing part is this: how would you even know what better means at that scale? Preventing one atrocity feels clear. But beyond that, the moral terrain becomes foggy. Would a more stable world produce less creativity? Would fewer collapses produce fewer breakthroughs? Would removing certain historical traumas also erase certain solidarities, certain movements for justice, certain forms of resilience, art, or moral awakening that arose in response to suffering? This is not an argument for cruelty. It is an argument for humility, because history is not only a record of what should not have happened, it is also the tangled origin of what did. And once you begin editing the roots, you may not control the flowering. This makes civilization rewrite a paradox of scale. At the personal level, intervention feels compassionate. At the civilizational level, intervention begins to resemble world building. And world building, when applied to real human beings, carries a nearly divine arrogance. There is also something haunting about the memory problem here. Suppose you do succeed in creating a more peaceful civilization. The new world grows stable, prosperous, and humane. Great horrors are absent. Entire categories of suffering have been prevented. Wonderful. And yet only the traveler remembers what was lost to create it. Only the traveler remembers the erased songs, the vanished cities, the unmade friendships, the extinct languages, the unborn generations, the historical textures that once existed in the old branch of reality. Everyone else lives naturally inside the rewritten world. Only the traveler carries the ghosts. That means civilization rewrite is not just a paradox of ethics, it is also a paradox of mourning. To create a better world may still require grieving the one that vanished, even if the vanished world was deeply flawed, even if much of it deserved to be transformed. Loss does not disappear simply because improvement occurs. The traveler becomes the lone archivist of an erased civilization. a witness to roads no one else remembers, a carrier of obsolete history, a person who knows in intimate detail what humanity once was before being edited into something else. There is a solemn loneliness in that. Still, perhaps the deepest lesson of this paradox is not that civilization should never be changed. Civilization is always changing, always rewriting itself through invention, conflict, migration, reform, memory, and forgetting. The real lesson may be that there is no clean distinction between repair and replacement once you intervene deeply enough in time. To save a civilization may mean ending it. To preserve the future may mean sacrificing the past that produced you. And perhaps that is the final sorrow hidden inside this dream, that the more completely you try to rescue history, the less likely it is to remain your history at all. In the end, you may stand inside a gentler world and still feel the ache of exile, not because the new civilization is wrong, but because you remember the old one, grandfather not. Of all the paradoxes that time travel creates, none is more famous or more quietly devastating than the one known as the grandfather paradox. It sounds almost simple at first, so simple in fact that it hardly seems capable of threatening the structure of the universe. And yet beneath its plain surface lies one of the deepest fractures in logic ever imagined. The idea is this: imagine that one day, somehow, you discover a way to travel into the past, not forward into some distant century of silver cities and artificial suns, but backward, into the fragile corridor of history. You step through whatever impossible machine or fold in reality makes this possible, and you arrive decades before your own birth. There, in that earlier world, you find your grandfather as a young man, long before he has children, long before he has built the family line that will eventually lead to you. And then, for whatever reason, you prevent him from having that future. Perhaps you stop him from meeting your grandmother. Perhaps you interrupt a single conversation, delay a train, alter a decision, or remove him from history entirely. The details do not matter. What matters is that your intervention erases the chain of events that would have led to your birth. And this is where the universe begins to tremble. Because if your grandfather never has children, then one of those children, your parent, is never born. And if your parent is never born, then neither are you. But if you were never born, then you could never have traveled into the past in the first place. And if you never traveled into the past, then your grandfather lives his life as before. Your family line remains intact, and you were born after all. Which means you do travel back, which means you stop it, which means you are never born, which means you never stop it. And so the contradiction turns endlessly, like a wheel with no axle, a loop of logic spinning in empty space. This is what makes the grandfather paradox so unsettling. It does not merely ask whether the past can be changed. It asks whether a universe that allows the past to be changed can remain logically coherent at all. At the heart of the paradox is something we usually take for granted: cause and effect. In ordinary life, causes come first. Effects come second. A stone is thrown, then the glass breaks. A match is struck, then the flame appears. A person is born, grows older, and only then can they act upon the world. Time gives events their order. It arranges reality into a sequence that makes sense, but time travel threatens to invert that sequence. If a person can move backward into the past, then an effect may arrive before its cause. A decision made in the future can interfere with the conditions that created that future. In other words, the universe begins to eat its own foundation. And perhaps that is why this paradox lingers so powerfully in the human imagination. It is not just about murder or ancestry or science fiction. It is about the possibility that reality itself may be more fragile than it appears. Take a moment to imagine it more gently, not as violence, but as a quiet interruption. A young man misses a train. A woman turns left instead of right. A letter never arrives. A glance is never exchanged across a room. And from that tiny change, an entire human life vanishes before it ever begins. That is the eerie beauty of the grandfather paradox. It reveals how much of existence depends on chains so delicate we almost never notice them. Every person is the result of an unbroken line of meetings, choices, survivals, and accidents stretching backward through time. To alter even one of them is not merely to change history. It is to dissolve possibility itself. In this way, the paradox becomes more than a puzzle. It becomes a meditation on contingency, on how strangely precarious it is that any of us are here at all. And so thinkers, physicists, and philosophers have long tried to find ways around the contradiction. One possible answer is the idea that the past cannot be changed. Under this view, if time travel were ever possible, then anything a traveler does in the past must already have been part of history all along. You may go back, you may speak to people, you may even believe you are changing events. But whatever you do was always woven into the fabric of what already happened. If you attempt to prevent your own birth, something will stop you, not because of magic, but because a contradiction cannot be allowed to occur. The gun jams. The train is delayed. The conversation still happens. History bends just enough to preserve itself. This idea is sometimes described as self-consistency, which simply means that reality must remain internally coherent. Events can loop, perhaps. They can become strange and circular, but they cannot become impossible. There is something almost comforting about that thought, a universe that protects its own continuity, a timeline that quietly resists being torn apart. And yet, there is also something chilling in it. Because if the past cannot be changed, then what becomes of free will? What does it mean to make a choice if every attempt to act differently is already accounted for? You may feel as though you're resisting fate, only to discover that your resisting was part of fate all along. The other great solution is more radical. Perhaps changing the past does not erase your future at all. Perhaps it simply creates a new one. In this version, the moment you interfere with history, the universe branches. One timeline continues without you, the one you came from. Another begins with your intervention. Your grandfather's life changes, your family line disappears, and a new world unfolds from that altered point onward. You survive, not because the paradox is solved, but because you remain a traveler from another branch of reality. This preserves logic, but at a cost. Because now time travel does not merely threaten one universe, it multiplies them. Every change creates another world. Every prevented meeting, every saved life, every interrupted tragedy opens a fresh corridor of existence. And somewhere, perhaps, each version continues endlessly, full of people who will never know the futures that were abandoned behind them. There is something haunting about that too. Not contradiction, but proliferation. Not collapse, but endless divergence. And perhaps this is what makes the grandfather paradox so enduring. It is not only a challenge to physics, it is a mirror held up to existence itself. It asks whether life is fixed or fragile, whether history is solid or branching, whether we are moving through a single inevitable story or drifting through a vast architecture of unrealized selves. Because in the end, the deepest terror of the paradox is not simply that you might erase yourself, it is that the universe may not know what to do when the child becomes the cause of the parent, when the effect reaches backward and strangles its own origin, when time ceases to behave like a path and becomes instead a knot tied so tightly that thought itself begins to fail. Bootstrap origin. If the grandfather paradox is a wound in cause and effect, then the bootstrap paradox is something stranger still. It is a wound in origin. It asks a question so simple and so unsettling that once it enters the mind, it is difficult to remove. Where do things come from? Normally, we believe every object, every idea, every piece of knowledge has a beginning. A book is written by an author. A melody is composed by a musician. A machine is designed by an engineer. A theorem is discovered by a mathematician after long effort and thought. In ordinary life, things appear to move in one direction. First there is invention, then transmission. First there is creation, then inheritance. But time travel allows for a more disturbing possibility. What if something exists without ever being created at all? Imagine for a moment a physicist working late into the night. She has spent years trying to solve a problem, a beautiful and impossible equation that no one has yet understood. She is exhausted, uncertain, and close to giving up. Then one evening, an older version of herself appears from the future and hands her a notebook. Inside is the solution. Every line of reasoning is already complete. Every symbol is in place. Every answer she has been searching for is waiting there, neat and finished. She studies the notebook, publishes the work, and becomes famous for solving the problem. Years later, after building the time machine that made it all possible, she travels back and hands the same notebook to her younger self. And now the question begins to echo. Who wrote the notebook? Not the younger physicist, because she only copied what she received. Not the older physicist, because she is only returning what she once found. The solution exists. The notebook exists. The knowledge is real, and yet it has no true beginning. It is caught in a circle. This is the essence of the bootstrap paradox, sometimes also called the ontological paradox, though in plain language it simply means a thing that exists without an origin, because it is trapped in a loop of time. It is one of the eeriest ideas in all of time travel, because it does not destroy reality with contradiction in the obvious way. Nothing explodes. No person vanishes. No timeline tears itself apart. Instead, something far more unnerving happens. Creation disappears. An object, idea, or piece of information is passed backward through time and becomes the very thing that later gets passed back again. It is self-sustaining, self-contained, a closed circle of existence with no first moment and no true author. Take another example. A young composer hears a haunting piano melody in a dream, or so she thinks. She writes it down, performs it, and over time it becomes one of the most beloved pieces of music ever created. Decades later, near the end of her life, she travels into the past and plays the melody for her younger self, unknowingly becoming the source of the very song she believed she had written. Again, the same quiet question returns. Who composed it? No one exactly, and yet it exists. There is something almost ghostly about that. A song with no composer. A book with no author. A theorem with no discoverer. A machine built from blueprints that were never designed, only inherited from the future and delivered into the past. It feels wrong, not because it is impossible to imagine, but because it violates something we depend on more deeply than we often realize. The belief that reality has beginnings. We are creatures of origin stories. We want to know where things started. We ask where a river begins, where a language formed, where a family line emerged, where a star was born. We look for first causes because they help the world feel stable. They tell us that things arise from somewhere, that existence unfolds in a meaningful order. The bootstrap paradox quietly removes that comfort. It presents a world in which some things are not born. They simply circulate, and this is where the paradox becomes more than a clever science fiction puzzle. It becomes philosophical, even existential, because if an object or idea can exist without a beginning, then perhaps our intuition about causality is less complete than we thought. Perhaps not everything in reality needs a first cause. Perhaps some things are not lines, but circles. Perhaps some things are not lines, but circles. That possibility has strange implications. Imagine a future historian receives a manuscript from a traveler who claims it is an original lost work from an ancient philosopher. The historian studies it, publishes it, and over time the text becomes foundational to an entire school of thought. Years later, someone from that future carries the manuscript into the past, where it is discovered and preserved as an ancient text. Once again, the work exists. It shapes civilization. It influences generations. But no one ever truly writes it. The words are real. Their origin is not. This creates a very unusual kind of emptiness. Not the emptiness of absence, but the emptiness of missing authorship. The thing is there, solid and present, but its beginning has been hollowed out, like a staircase with every step intact except the first one. And perhaps that is what makes the bootstrap paradox so unnerving. It suggests that time travel does not merely allow us to revisit history, it allows reality to become self-referential. A thing can point backward to itself as its own explanation. A loop can become its own justification. An answer can exist before the question. In mathematics and logic, self-reference has always been dangerous. It produces strange loops, recursive structures, and statements that fold in on themselves. It is the kind of thing that can make even formal systems tremble. And here, in the bootstrap paradox, self-reference enters not just language or logic, but existence itself. The universe begins to resemble a hall of mirrors. Every origin reflects another origin. Every source points to a source that is only itself seen from a different angle and time. And if you stare into that mirror long enough, something very subtle begins to happen. The idea of originality starts to dissolve. Because what does it mean to create something if what you create is only what you were given by your future self? What does it mean to discover a truth if the truth arrived already complete? What does genius mean in a universe where inspiration can be delivered backward? There is something melancholy in that. The thought that a masterpiece could exist without imagination, that brilliance could circulate without ever being born, and yet there is also a strange beauty to it, a kind of impossible elegance. The image of a single idea passing through centuries, untouched by decay, authorless yet enduring, moving through time like a candle whose flame is never lit, only transferred. Perhaps that is why this paradox lingers so powerfully. It feels both unnatural and poetic. It violates reason, yet does so with such quiet symmetry that it almost feels sacred. Still, the deeper you think about it, the more unsettling it becomes. Because if one object can exist without origin, why not many? Why not entire systems of knowledge? Why not civilizations built on ideas no one ever invented? Why not religions, technologies, laws, or identities passed in loops so old and self-contained that their beginning has vanished forever? And then inevitably, the thought turns inward. What if even the self is less original than it seems? What if parts of who you are, your beliefs, your fears, your ambitions, your voice, are not things you truly created, but things inherited through loops of influence so deep and recursive that their origin can no longer be found? In that sense, the bootstrap paradox is not only about time machines, it is about the eerie possibility that existence itself may be less linear than we imagine, that some things do not begin, they only return, and somewhere, perhaps, in the silent architecture of time, there are ideas still moving in circles, waiting to be discovered by the very minds that once received them. Predestination. Spiral. There is a particular kind of paradox that feels less like a puzzle and more like a trap. Not because it confuses the mind, but because it quietly removes the illusion of escape. It begins with a deeply human impulse, the desire to prevent disaster. To go back. To warn someone. To stop a tragedy before it unfolds. To undo a mistake before it hardens into history. This is one of the oldest fantasies in the human imagination. If only we had known. If only we had arrived sooner. If only one small moment had been interrupted, perhaps everything afterward would have changed. But the predestination paradox suggests something much darker. It suggests that sometimes the very act of trying to stop an event is what causes it to happen in the first place. And if that is true, then time does not simply resist interference, it absorbs it. Imagine this. A scientist in the future discovers that a terrible explosion destroyed an entire city decades earlier. The records are clear. Thousands died. The event became a permanent scar in history. Horrified, the scientist builds a machine and travels into the past, determined to stop it. She arrives just hours before the catastrophe. She races through unfamiliar streets, tries to locate the source, and in the chaos of her intervention, accidentally damages the very system she was trying to protect. The malfunction spirals. The chain reaction begins, and in the end, the explosion happens exactly as history recorded it. Only now, the cause is not random failure. The cause is her. She went back to prevent the disaster, and by doing so, she became the reason it occurred. That is the core of the predestination paradox. The future gives rise to the past, and the past gives rise to the future, but in such a way that every attempt to alter the timeline becomes part of the timeline itself. Nothing changes. and yet everything still happens because someone tried to change it. There is something almost cruel about that. The universe does not merely ignore your effort, it uses it. This is what makes the paradox so psychologically unsettling. It attacks one of our deepest assumptions, the belief that knowledge creates freedom. In ordinary life, we think that if we know what is coming, we can act differently. We can prepare, we can avoid danger, we can rewrite the future through awareness. But the predestination paradox suggests that awareness may not liberate us at all. It may simply lead us more efficiently into the thing we were always going to do. A warning becomes a trigger, a rescue becomes a cause, a rebellion becomes the mechanism of fate. And so time begins to feel less like a road and more like a tightening spiral. The more you struggle, the more you complete the pattern. There are many ways this paradox can unfold. A traveler learns that a loved one dies in an accident and goes back to save them, only to cause the very delay or distraction that places them in harm's way. A historian uncovers a cryptic message left in the past and eventually realizes it was written by his own future self, sent backward in a desperate attempt to alter events that could never be altered. A child hears a mysterious warning as a young person, grows up haunted by it, and later discovers that the voice was their own, speaking from the future in an attempt to protect the child they once were. Again and again, the same structure appears. The event happens because someone knew it would happen. The future is not escaped, it is fulfilled. This gives the paradox a very different emotional texture from the grandfather paradox or the bootstrap paradox. The grandfather paradox is sharp and contradictory. The bootstrap paradox is eerie and originless, but the predestination paradox feels almost mythic. It has the structure of ancient tragedy. In old stories, kings receive prophecies and ruin themselves trying to avoid them. Parents abandon children to prevent a foretold future, only to create it. Warriors hear of their fate and walk directly toward it under the illusion of defiance. The more desperately they resist, the more tightly they are woven into the pattern they fear. Time travel simply modernizes that old terror. It replaces oracles with machines, prophecy with information, fate with causality. But the emotional shape remains the same. You are warned, you act, and your action becomes the warning fulfilled. There is a haunting elegance to this, a kind of perfect cruelty in the way the loop closes. The universe appears not chaotic but exquisitely arranged, as though every attempt to break the design only reveals how complete the design already was. And this raises a disturbing question. What if free will is real, but only locally? What if, inside each moment, you truly feel that you are choosing, deciding, resisting, improvising, and yet from the perspective of the whole timeline, every one of those choices is already part of the completed shape? In that case, freedom may not vanish entirely, it may simply become too small to alter the larger architecture. You are free to move inside the maze, but not free to leave it. That possibility has a strangely calming and terrifying quality at the same time. On one hand, it suggests order, the idea that the universe is not random, not loose, not vulnerable to contradiction, but held together by deep internal consistency. Every event fits. Every thread returns to the tapestry. On the other hand, it suggests inevitability, that some things, no matter how desperately we wish otherwise, are not negotiable. Some doors lead where they always led. Some moments arrive because they were always arriving. And some tragedies are not prevented by foresight, but completed by it. Take a moment to imagine the emotional weight of that. To know the future, to hate it, to devote your life to stopping it, only to discover, in the end, that your devotion was one of the gears turning the machine. There is something deeply human in that image, because even without time travel, many of us live inside smaller versions of this paradox. We fear becoming like our parents and move in ways that slowly shape us into their reflection. We avoid one kind of pain and create another through the very avoidance. We run from certain endings and arrive there exhausted, convinced we chose them freely. Patterns repeat. Not always because we are weak, sometimes because the act of resisting a pattern keeps us bound to it. That is why the predestination paradox feels so intimate. It is not just about physics, It is about repetition, self-fulfilling fear, and the possibility that life itself contains loops too subtle for us to notice until we are already inside them. And perhaps that is the deepest unease at the heart of this paradox, not merely that the future can influence the past, but that meaning itself may move in circles, that the things we do to save ourselves may become the things we needed saving from, that every warning may already contain its own fulfillment. And that time, far from being an open horizon, may in some hidden places already be complete. A finished shape, a sealed design, the spiral turning inward, so that when we reach out to change what is coming, we do not break the pattern. We simply place our hand upon it and help it close. Causal loop. If the predestination paradox feels like fate tightening around a single event, then the causal loop is broader, stranger, and somehow even more hypnotic. It is not just one moment closing in on itself. It is an entire chain of events becoming circular, a beginning that is also an ending that is also a beginning, a loop in which cause creates effect, and effect circles back to create cause, until the distinction between first and last begins to dissolve. At first, this may sound similar to the bootstrap paradox, and in many ways they are closely related. But where the bootstrap paradox usually focuses on a single object, idea, or piece of information with no clear origin, the causal loop is larger. It can contain events, decisions, people, warnings, inventions, relationships, even entire histories. It is not just a thing trapped in time. It is a sequence trapped in time. And once you begin to imagine such a sequence, reality starts to feel less like a line and more like a circle drawn so perfectly that you can no longer tell where the pen first touched the page. Imagine this. A woman receives a strange letter one evening. The handwriting is familiar, though she cannot place it. Inside, there is a warning. It tells her not to board a certain train on a certain date. She obeys, though she does not understand why. The train crashes. Many people die. She survives. The experience changes her life. Years later, after a long chain of events, she becomes obsessed with the mystery of the letter. She studies time travel, devotes herself to impossible machines, and eventually succeeds. Realizing that she herself was always the sender, she travels into the past and places the letter where her younger self will find it. Now pause there. Who saved her life? The letter did. But who wrote the letter? She did. Why did she write it? Because the letter once saved her life. And why was she alive to write it? Because the letter saved her life. The loop closes. No contradiction appears in the obvious sense. No one vanishes. Nothing seems broken. Every event has a cause. Every action has an explanation. And yet, something is profoundly wrong. Because if you trace the chain backward far enough, you never arrive at a true beginning. The sequence is complete, but is not grounded. It explains itself by referring only to itself. That is what makes a causal loop so eerie. It is not irrational in the way nonsense is irrational. It is too rational, too neat, too perfectly self-contained. It behaves like a machine whose gears all turn smoothly, but which is floating in empty space with no foundation beneath it. It works, but it should not feel this complete. This is why causal loops are so haunting to think about. They challenge our intuition that events must unfold in a forward direction, that every chain must begin somewhere, that every story must have a first page. But perhaps not. Perhaps some stories are circles, and perhaps some circles are stable. There is something almost dreamlike about that possibility. The idea that a message, a warning, a person, or an invention could move through time not as a line, but as a closed orbit, forever causing itself, forever causing itself, forever sustaining itself, forever avoiding the question of origin by refusing to have one. Take another example. A young engineer discovers a broken machine in an abandoned laboratory. After years of study, she repairs it and realizes it is a prototype for a device far beyond current science. It becomes the foundation of a revolutionary technology. Much later, after building her own advanced version, she travels into the past and leaves the damaged prototype in that same abandoned laboratory, where her younger self will one day find it. Again, The loop is complete. The machine exists. It has been studied, repaired, understood, improved, and yet it was never truly invented in the ordinary sense. Its existence is suspended inside a circle of causation. This is where the causal loop becomes philosophically dangerous, because it asks whether explanation and origin are actually the same thing. We often assume they are. If we can explain where something came from, we feel we understand it, but a causal loop separates those ideas. It gives you explanation without origin. Every step is accounted for. Every event is caused, and still nothing ever truly begins. That is deeply unsettling. It suggests that reality may be capable of supporting structures that are perfectly coherent from the inside while remaining fundamentally ungrounded from the outside. In other words, time may allow events to orbit themselves. And if that is true, then the universe is stranger than simple cause and effect ever allowed us to believe. There is also something psychologically intimate about loops like these, because even outside of science fiction, human life often feels circular. A parent teaches a child a fear they themselves inherited from a parent. A phrase echoes through generations. A wound becomes a pattern. A lesson becomes a habit becomes a destiny. The beginning is hard to find because each part was shaped by the one before it and often by the one after it, in ways we only understand much later. In that sense, the causal loop is not only a temporal puzzle, it is a metaphor for the strange recursions of human existence. We become the causes of things that once shaped us. We return to moments that formed us and unconsciously recreate them. We inherit patterns and pass them on, becoming both product and producer of the same unfolding structure. That is perhaps why these loops feel so believable, even when they are impossible. They resonate with something already present in us. Still, time travel sharpens that feeling into something more precise, more eerie, more absolute. In a true causal loop, there may be no outside at all, no untouched beginning, no original version, only repetition with continuity, a chain that holds together because each link supports the next, even though the whole chain hangs in midair. And if you think about that for long enough, another unsettling possibility begins to emerge. What if the universe itself contains loops? Not just events inside it, but laws, structures, perhaps even the conditions of existence itself. What if some parts of reality do not rest on deeper foundations, but on recursive stability? What if certain truths endure not because they were first, but because they close neatly enough to survive? That thought moves us very close to the edge of something profound, because if time can sustain loops without origin, then perhaps reality is not built entirely from beginnings. Perhaps some things are held together by closure instead, by returning, by repeating, by folding back into themselves so elegantly that they no longer require an external source. And there is something both beautiful and unsettling in that image. A universe where not everything is born, a world in which some events do not move from start to finish, but circulate like planets around an invisible center, a hidden geometry of recurrence, a structure made not of progress but of return. As we drift deeper into these paradoxes, this idea becomes harder to ignore. That time may not always behave like a river. In some places, perhaps, it behaves like a ring, timeline fracture. There is a comforting illusion most of us carry without ever noticing it, the illusion that reality is stable, that history, once it has happened, is solid, fixed, sealed behind us like a road already traveled. We imagine the past as something complete, something settled into place, every choice locked where it belongs, every consequence already accounted for. But time travel introduces a far more unsettling possibility. Not just that the past can be changed, but that even the smallest change might be enough to fracture everything. This is the paradox of the timeline fracture. It is the idea that history is not a smooth wall, but a delicate structure of interdependent events. And if you alter even one tiny piece, the effects may spread outward in ways too vast, too subtle, and too chaotic to ever fully predict. A missed meeting, a delayed train, a dropped coin, a sentence never spoken, a glance that fails to happen. From the outside, these seem like nothing. Small disturbances, barely enough to register against the enormous machinery of the world. And yet time is built from such moments. History is not made only of wars and revolutions and kings and discoveries. It is also made of breakfast conversations, weather patterns, traffic delays, forgotten letters, wrong turns, chance encounters, and moments of hesitation so small that they vanish before anyone notices they mattered. The timeline fracture asks a terrifying question. What if every one of those moments matters more than we can possibly understand? Imagine that you travel back only a single day. You do not kill anyone. You do not stop a war. You do not try to rewrite civilization. You simply walk through a city, unnoticed and harmless, and in one absent-minded moment, you bump into a stranger on a sidewalk. They pause for 2 extra seconds. Because of that delay, they miss a bus. Because they miss the bus, they take another route. Because they take another route, they meet someone they would never have met. A conversation happens. A relationship forms. A child is born who otherwise never would have existed. And somewhere else, because one person was not where they were supposed to be, another sequence of events quietly disappears. A future is replaced. A family line is rewritten. An invention is delayed. A tragedy is avoided. Or perhaps caused. And no one, not even the traveler, can trace the full extent of what has changed. That is what makes timeline fracture so deeply disturbing. Unlike the grandfather paradox, it does not depend on a single dramatic contradiction. Unlike the bootstrap paradox, it does not rely on eerie circularity. Instead, it emerges from complexity, from the fact that reality may be too interconnected for any alteration, however small, to remain isolated. In ordinary life, we often imagine that causes are proportional to effects. Big causes create big outcomes. Small causes create small ones. But that is not always how systems behave. Some systems are sensitive, meaning a tiny shift at the beginning can grow larger and larger over time until it reshapes the entire structure. This is sometimes discussed through what is often called the butterfly effect. The poetic idea that a butterfly moving its wings in one place might, through a chain of atmospheric consequences, contribute to a storm somewhere far away. The phrase is symbolic, of course, but the underlying principle is profound. In certain systems, small changes do not stay small. They multiply, they branch, they amplify. And if time itself is such a system, then traveling into the past would not be like stepping into a museum. It would be like stepping into a field of dry grass with a single spark in your hand. Even the gentlest touch might become irreversible. Take a moment to imagine the emotional weight of that. To know that your presence alone is disruptive. That merely breathing in the wrong century might alter the chemical path of a room. That speaking one sentence to one stranger might ripple through generations. That your footprints, your bacteria, your timing, your attention, your silence could all become hidden levers inside history. The paradox here is subtle but devastating, because if changing the past is possible, then control may be impossible. You may travel back with a clear intention. Save one person, prevent one accident, correct one mistake. But the timeline is not a single thread you can tug neatly. It is more like a woven fabric. Pull one strand and tension redistributes everywhere. The shape changes in ways no one can fully foresee. This is where the paradox becomes existential. Because what exactly are you trying to preserve when you fix the past? Suppose you save someone who originally died young. That seems good, obvious even, compassionate. But because that person survives, they later influence dozens of others. Some lives improve, others worsen. New children are born. Old relationships never happen. Entire emotional and biological histories diverge. Soon, the future you came from no longer exists, not because of one dramatic rupture, but because of accumulated divergence. And that leads to a deeply unsettling possibility. If history changes enough, you may no longer belong to the world you created. This is one of the quiet horrors hidden inside time travel. We often imagine the traveler as a hero or observer, someone who changes events and then returns home. But what if home has been erased? What if, by saving one life, you dissolve the entire chain of events that once gave rise to your own memories, your relationships, your identity, your sense of what the world is? You might survive physically, but the world waiting for you would not be yours. It would be adjacent. Familiar in shape perhaps, but not in substance. The same streets, but different lives. The same sky, but different histories. The same people, but altered by causes you can no longer map. That is the fracture. Not a clean break, but a spreading instability. A world that still appears intact, yet is no longer the one that produced you. And perhaps that is why this paradox feels so hauntingly close to real life. Because even without time travel, we already live among fractures we barely understand. A chance meeting changes a marriage. A missed flight changes a career. A single illness alters a generation. A brief moment of courage or fear can redirect an entire life. Again and again, we discover that existence is not built on certainty, but on branching sensitivity. Time travel simply magnifies that truth until it becomes unbearable. It asks us to confront the possibility that history is not robust at all, that the world is not held together by inevitability, but by a delicate and ongoing balance of countless interacting accidents. And if that is true, then the universe may be less like a machine and more like a crystal. Beautiful, structured, coherent, but vulnerable to stress in ways that are not always visible until the fracture begins. A single crack, then another, then a spreading network of invisible lines beneath the surface. Still, there is something strangely beautiful in this too. The realization that reality is not only large, but exquisitely sensitive. That every life is entangled with others in ways too intricate to fully trace. That each moment, however ordinary, participates in a structure far more alive and fragile than it appears. Perhaps that is the true lesson of the timeline fracture. Not merely that time travel is dangerous, but that existence itself is delicate, that every history is precarious, that every future rests upon an uncountable number of quiet moments, holding together just long enough to become a world. Twin futures. There is something uniquely eerie about the idea of meeting yourself, not metaphorically, not in the ordinary sense of becoming who you were meant to be, but literally standing face to face with another version of you, drawn from a different point along the same life. The same eyes, perhaps older. The same voice, but altered by years you have not yet lived. The same mind, carrying memories you do not yet possess. Of all the paradoxes of time travel, this one may be the most intimate, because it does not merely threaten the structure of history, it threatens the structure of the self. At first, the fantasy seems almost irresistible. Who would not want to know? To ask your older self what matters, what to avoid, whom to trust, which choices to make, what mistakes not to repeat. The temptation is obvious. Why stumble through uncertainty when the future version of you has already survived it? And yet the moment you imagine such a meeting seriously, the comfort begins to dissolve, because the first paradox appears almost immediately. If you become who you are because you met your future self, then who were you before the meeting? Imagine a young man in his 20s, uncertain and drifting, unsure of what to do with his life. One night he is visited by an older version of himself. The older man is calm, confident, accomplished. He gives the younger man a series of instructions. Study this subject. Move to this city. Do not marry that person. Take this opportunity when it appears. The younger version follows the advice, and over the years his life gradually transforms. Eventually, he becomes the older man who once visited him, and then, years later, he travels back and delivers the same instructions to his younger self. The loop closes neatly enough. But something very strange has happened. The younger self became the older self because he received the advice, and the older self gave the advice because he had once become that person. So where did the wisdom actually come from? Who made the original decision? Who first became the version worth imitating? The answer begins to slip away. This is the central unease of what we might call the twin futures paradox. When you meet another version of yourself, identity stops behaving like a line and begins to behave like a loop. You are influenced by yourself. You are shaped by someone you will become. And in being shaped by them, you ensure that you become them. The self begins to fold inward. At first, this seems like only a variation of the bootstrap paradox, and in a technical sense it is related. But emotionally, it is something much deeper, because when the thing without origin is not a machine or a notebook or a melody, but your own personality, the paradox becomes much more unsettling. You are no longer asking where an object came from. You are asking where you came from. What if your confidence was inherited from your future self? What if your fears were planted by an older version of you trying to protect you? What if your ambitions, your loves, your regrets, your sense of destiny all emerged not naturally, but through recursive self-contact? Then your life is no longer simply unfolding. It is being fed back into itself, and that raises a profound question. Can a person remain free after meeting the person they become? Suppose your future self tells you exactly how your life will go. Not every detail, perhaps, but enough to make certain paths feel inevitable. Enough to make every choice feel haunted by foreknowledge. Even if you try to resist, the knowledge remains. You are no longer choosing from an open field. You are choosing inside the shadow of what you have already seen. That is where the paradox becomes psychological. Because the danger is not only that your future influences your past, the danger is that your future begins to colonize your present. Your current self may start living in imitation of your future self, rather than in discovery of who you might have become on your own. You might begin to shape your voice to sound like theirs, your habits to match theirs, your decisions to fulfill the version already witnessed. And in doing so, you become trapped, not by force, but by self-recognition. The future becomes a role you feel compelled to perform. Take a moment to imagine the emotional weight of that. To meet yourself at 40, 50, 70 years old and realize that from that moment on, every day of your life will be measured against that encounter. Every success or failure, every wrinkle of character, every compromise, every fear, you would no longer be growing in the dark. You would be growing under observation, observed by the very person you are trying to become. And perhaps this is why the idea feels so haunting, because human identity is already unstable, even without time travel. We are never exactly one thing. We are always changing, forgetting, revising, contradicting, becoming. The self is not a fixed object. It is a process, a conversation between memory and desire, habit and choice, continuity and reinvention. Time travel disrupts that process by making the self simultaneous. The child, the adult, and the elder may all coexist, and once they do, the illusion of a single unified identity begins to crack. Which version is the real you? The younger self, full of possibility? The older self, shaped by consequence? The one before the meeting, or the one after it? It may sound like a philosophical game, but the implications are serious. If your future self gives you knowledge, are your later decisions truly yours? If your younger self refuses to follow your path, do you cease to be who you are? If you try to warn your younger self away from becoming you and succeed, what happens to the self who delivered the warning? The contradiction begins to spread. You may try to save yourself from your own mistakes, but if you succeed, then the version of you who learned from those mistakes may never exist. And if that version never exists, then no one is left to give the warning. This creates a very personal form of paradox, a self that depends on suffering trying to erase the suffering that created it, a future identity attempting to rescue a past identity from becoming the very person who came back. There is something deeply tragic in that, because it suggests that growth itself may be paradoxical, that the wisdom we wish we could send backward may only exist because we were once unable to receive it. And perhaps that is true even without time travel. How many of us wish we could speak to earlier versions of ourselves, warn them, comfort them, interrupt certain choices, offer language for pain they had not yet learned how to name. And yet if we truly altered those moments, would we still become who we are? Would the self survive the rescue? That is the quiet heartbreak inside this paradox, to love your younger self enough to want to save them, and to know that saving them may erase the very person who returned. Still, there is also something strangely beautiful here, the image of a life curved back upon itself. A person reaching through time not to conquer history, but to encounter their own becoming. To see, perhaps for the first time, that identity is not a destination, but a recursion, a pattern that learns from itself, a consciousness folding across years in search of coherence. Perhaps that is what makes meeting yourself so compelling. It reveals that the self was never a simple line moving forward. It was always layered, always haunted by its earlier and later forms. Always in dialogue with versions not fully gone and not yet here. And if time travel ever made that dialogue literal, then the strangest discovery might not be that the universe is unstable. It might be that you are infinite return. Of all the strange shapes that time can take, perhaps none is more haunting than the loop. Not a loop in the abstract sense, not a circle drawn on paper or a theory sketched on a blackboard, but a lived loop. A stretch of time that repeats itself over and over again, not once or twice, but endlessly. The same hour, the same day, the same room, the same choices, the same conversation beginning again before it ever truly ends. There is something uniquely unsettling about that image, because ordinary life moves forward, even when it feels repetitive. We wake, we sleep, we repeat routines, but beneath those repetitions, time still carries us onward. Hair grows, bodies age, seasons turn, memories accumulate, even boredom has a direction. But a true time loop removes that direction. It creates a world in which duration exists, but progress does not. And that is the heart of what we might call the infinite return paradox. The paradox is simple to describe and almost impossible to emotionally absorb. If a person becomes trapped in a repeating interval of time, then events occur again and again. But if those events truly reset, then in one sense nothing is retained. And if nothing is retained, then no suffering, no learning, no meaning can accumulate. Yet if the trapped person does retain memory, then the loop becomes a prison of perfect recurrence, where consciousness continues while the world remains frozen in repetition. In either case, something breaks. Either time loses memory, or memory loses time. Imagine waking up each morning to the same date, the same light through the same window, the same radio voice, the same breakfast conversation. At first, it might feel almost amusing, then surreal, then liberating. You could experiment, take risks, ignore consequences, speak truths you would normally bury, learn the pattern of every face and every street. You would become, in a strange way, more powerful than everyone around you because you would possess the only thing they lack, continuity. They live the same day once. You live it 1,000 times. But eventually, something deeper begins to happen. The world starts to lose texture. Because novelty depends on time moving forward. Surprise depends on irreversibility. Meaning, in many ways, depends on the fact that moments disappear. But inside a loop, disappearance is suspended. Everything returns. Every unfinished conversation resets. Every death is undone. Every tenderness is erased by mourning. Every apology evaporates. Every promise collapses before it can become history. The loop becomes a strange kind of immortality without growth. You continue. The world does not. That is what makes it so eerie. The infinite return paradox is not only about repetition, it is about the collapse of consequence. And once consequence begins to vanish, identity itself starts to blur. Who are you when your actions no longer leave lasting marks? What becomes of morality when every wrong can be undone by midnight? What becomes of love when every bond resets before it deepens? What becomes of grief when loss returns and disappears in endless cycles? At first glance, a time loop may seem like a fantasy of control, unlimited retries, infinite second chances, the ability to master every moment through repetition. But beneath that fantasy lies something much darker, because a loop does not simply give you more time, it traps you in the same time. And those are not the same thing. Take a moment to imagine the psychological weight of that, to know exactly what every person will say before they say it. To memorize the sequence of every sound in the street, to hear the same laughter, the same argument, the same footsteps, the same weather, the same music, not as comfort, but as inevitability. Eventually, the world begins to feel less like a place and more like a recording, and you begin to wonder whether you are still living at all. This is one of the deepest paradoxes inside the loop. A repeated moment can become both overly familiar and increasingly unreal. The more perfectly it returns, the more fragile your sense of reality becomes. Because reality, as we normally experience it, is built on difference. One second gives way to another. One choice excludes another. One version of the day replaces all the others that could have been. But in a loop, those exclusions lose their force. You can choose one path today and another tomorrow, even though tomorrow is the same day. You can confess love, commit betrayal, vanish from your life, start over, all without lasting consequence. And yet somehow this does not create freedom. It creates exhaustion. Because freedom without continuity eventually becomes weightless, and weightless things are hard to care about. This is why the infinite return paradox is so philosophically rich. It forces us to ask whether meaning comes from pleasure, novelty, consequence, memory, or simply movement through irreversible time. Would a perfect day still be beautiful if it happened forever? Would pain become tolerable if it repeated enough times? Would joy remain joy if it could not be lost? These are not easy questions, and in a loop they become unavoidable. There is also a more technical strangeness hidden here. If a loop repeats exactly, then from the outside it may appear that nothing unusual is happening at all. The same events occur in the same order. The same causal chain closes again and again. But from the inside, if memory persists, the trapped person is effectively moving through a private timeline nested inside a public stillness. The world remains circular. The mind becomes linear, and so a split emerges between external time and internal time. That split is deeply unsettling, because it suggests that the true prison is not the repeated world itself, but the consciousness forced to carry continuity through a reality that refuses to progress. You become the only witness to accumulation in a universe of reset, and perhaps that is why time loops often feel so lonely in the imagination. Not merely because no one believes you, but because no one can join you. Everyone else is preserved in recurrence, while you alone drift forward in invisible increments. You age emotionally inside a world that does not age with you. You become ancient inside a single afternoon. There is something almost tragic in that image. A person who has lived through 10,000 versions of the same sunset, who has heard the same final words so many times they have lost all sound, who has learned every possible variation of a moment and still cannot escape it. And perhaps that is where the paradox becomes existential in the deepest sense. Because many lives already contain smaller loops. Habits repeated, fears repeated, arguments repeated, fears repeated, days that blur into each other so completely that time begins to feel circular, even when it is not. The loop becomes a metaphor for all the invisible recursions we inhabit, the patterns we swear we will break and then quietly re-enter, the emotional climates we revisit, the versions of ourselves we keep becoming despite our best intentions. In that sense, the infinite return paradox is not only about science fiction, it is about the possibility that repetition, when stripped of novelty and consequence, reveals something uncomfortable about consciousness itself. That the mind needs not only experience but progression, not only memory but transformation, not only time but the feeling that time is carrying us somewhere. Without that, existence begins to flatten, and even eternity starts to feel small. Still, there is a strange beauty in the loop as well, a quiet invitation hidden inside its terror. Because if one moment could contain infinite returns, then perhaps no moment is ever as small as it seems. Perhaps every ordinary second already holds layers we never fully see. Repeated gestures, unnoticed details, subtle variations, emotional weather too fine to register until we are forced to remain with it. Perhaps what the loop really reveals is not only the horror of endless repetition, but the depth concealed inside even the simplest fragment of time: information ghosts. Not all time travelers need machines. Some arrive as messages: a warning scribbled on a page, a voice on an old recording, a line of numbers sent from nowhere, a file appearing in a computer before it was ever written, a sentence that should not exist yet, waiting quietly in the present, like a footprint left by a future that has not happened. There is something especially eerie about this kind of paradox because information feels lighter than matter, easier to imagine slipping through cracks in time. A person traveling backward feels dramatic, cinematic, almost too large to believe. But a message, a formula, a date, a few whispered words, that feels disturbingly plausible. And that is where the paradox begins. Because once information can move backward through time, knowledge itself becomes unstable. This is what we might call the information ghost paradox. It is the paradox of receiving knowledge from the future and then discovering that the knowledge may have altered, erased, or even created the very future that sent it. In other words, the message becomes haunted by its own consequences. Imagine this. One evening, a scientist receives an anonymous transmission. It contains a sequence of numbers and a short instruction. Do not begin the experiment on Thursday. The message is precise, impossible to trace, and clearly meaningful to no one except her. She hesitates, but obeys. On Thursday, instead of beginning the experiment, she delays it by 1 day. Later, she learns that had she proceeded as planned, the test would have caused a catastrophic failure, one that in the original timeline killed several people and eventually led future researchers to send the warning back. But now the experiment never fails. The deaths never happen. The future researchers are never motivated to send the message. So who sent it? And if no one sent it, why was it received? The contradiction here is subtle, almost spectral. Unlike the grandfather paradox, which is loud and direct, this one drifts in quietly. It hides inside foresight. It does not ask whether you can kill your own ancestor. It asks something more elusive. Can knowledge survive, changing the future that produced it? At first, it may seem as though the answer should be yes. After all, if the message already arrived, then perhaps it simply exists. But the deeper you think about it, the stranger it becomes. Because information is not neutral. It does things. It changes behavior. And the moment future knowledge enters the present begins to diverge from the conditions that originally created that knowledge. This means that every warning from the future contains a strange possibility inside it, that by being understood, it may invalidate itself. A message can become the reason it should never have existed. That is what makes it a ghost. It is real. It arrives. It speaks. And yet its source may already be dissolving the moment it is heard. There is something deeply uncanny about that. A future reaching backward not as a person, but as a fragment of intention. A piece of evidence from a world that may vanish the instant it succeeds. A whisper from a reality already in the process of erasing itself. Take a moment to imagine the emotional weight of such a thing, to receive a letter from your future self that says only, "Do not get on the plane." You obey. The crash never happens. You survive. And because you survive, you never become the person desperate enough to send the warning. So the message should not exist. And yet it sits in your hand, ink on paper. A physical trace of a timeline now gone, a remnant of a future that has been cancelled. There is something almost mournful in that image. A message is the last surviving artifact of a world that no longer has the right to exist. And perhaps that is why this paradox feels so emotionally powerful, because information is intimate. It enters not through force, but through meaning. It changes reality not by breaking matter, but by redirecting choice. A sentence can alter a life. A number can alter an economy. A diagnosis can alter a family. A prediction can alter history. This makes information uniquely dangerous in any theory of time travel because it is both fragile and powerful. It does not need to be large to be transformative. It only needs to be believed. And that introduces another disturbing possibility. What if the future can manipulate the present simply by speaking to it? Imagine a world in which messages from tomorrow become common. Governments receive military warnings. Investors receive market data. Scientists receive discoveries before making them. Police receive evidence before crimes occur. At first, it might seem like a triumph. A civilization armed with foresight, suffering prevented. Errors corrected. Deaths avoided. Errors corrected. Deaths avoided. But very quickly, reality begins to destabilize because every future message changes the present, and every changed present creates a new future, which may send different messages which create further changes, and so on. The result is not clarity. It is temporal interference. Too much knowledge arrives too early. Too many causes are contaminated by effects. The present becomes crowded with instructions from futures that may never happen, and eventually no one can tell which version of tomorrow they are obeying. That is the true horror of information ghosts. Not simply that the future can warn us, but that warnings themselves may multiply uncertainty. A future prediction can create the very event it hoped to avoid. A forecast of panic can cause panic. A prophecy of collapse can become collapse. A warning about betrayal can generate the distrust that produces betrayal. This is where the paradox becomes almost psychological rather than physical, because information does not only change what happens, it changes how minds anticipate what might happen. And once expectation shifts, reality often follows. In that sense, information ghosts are not only about time travel. They are about the unsettling power of knowledge itself. How knowing too much can distort action. How seeing ahead can narrow freedom. How the mind, once infected with a possible future, begins to live inside it before it arrives. We already experience smaller versions of this in ordinary life. A medical test result changes a person before the illness fully does. A financial prediction changes markets before the event occurs. A rumor alters relationships before the truth is known. Again and again, information acts not as a mirror of reality, but as a force inside reality. Time travel simply sharpens that truth into something uncanny. A world where the future does not wait to happen, but leaks backward in fragments. A world where tomorrow sends ghosts. And perhaps the most unsettling question of all is this: can any message from the future ever be trusted? Not because it is false, but because the act of trusting it may already be enough to make it false. This is the paradox at its deepest point. A message may be accurate only until it is understood. Its truth may survive only in ignorance. The moment it is read, its conditions begin to change. And so knowledge becomes unstable. Prediction becomes corrosive. The future becomes not a destination, but a haunting. Something half-formed, half-erased, trying to speak through static before the world that generated it disappears. There is something strangely beautiful in that too. The idea that somewhere, in some version of reality, people may be sending messages not because they know they will succeed, but because they hope even a single phrase might survive the collapse of their timeline. Hitler problem. There is one question that appears almost immediately whenever people begin talking seriously about time travel. It is so common, so morally charged, and so disturbingly simple that it has become almost unavoidable. If you could go back in time and stop one of history's greatest monsters before they rose to power, would you? This is sometimes framed as a thought experiment about Adolf Hitler. Not because he is the only example of historical evil, but because he has become, in the modern imagination, a symbol of catastrophe concentrated into a single person, a shorthand for horror, a human face attached to war, genocide, propaganda, mass manipulation, and industrialized cruelty. And so the question emerges with brutal clarity. If you could travel into the past and prevent his rise, or prevent his birth entirely, would that not be the most obvious moral use of time travel? At first, the answer seems immediate. Of course, how could anyone hesitate? But the longer you sit with the question, the more it begins to mutate into something darker and more complicated. Because this is not just a question about one man, it is a question about whether history can be surgically repaired, and that assumption may itself be a paradox. Let us begin with the simplest version. Imagine you travel to the early 20th century. You find the young man who will one day become a dictator. You remove him from history before he can become who he was. Perhaps you prevent his birth. Perhaps you stop him as a child. Perhaps you intervene just before he enters politics. From the perspective of moral intuition, this seems clean. One person is removed. Millions are saved. A nightmare is prevented. But time travel is rarely so simple, because history is not a single thread tied to a single life. It is a dense web of economic collapse, national humiliation, cultural resentment, institutional weakness, charismatic influence, technological change, military failure, ideological currents, and mass psychology. A dictator does not rise from nothing. He emerges from conditions. And that is where the paradox begins. If you remove the person but not the conditions, what exactly have you prevented? Perhaps without Hitler, another extremist rises in his place. Perhaps someone more competent, less theatrical, and therefore even more dangerous. Perhaps the war still happens but unfolds differently. Perhaps the genocide takes another form. Perhaps one catastrophe is avoided only to create another that history never recorded because it belonged to a different branch of possibility. This is what makes the Hitler problem so philosophically disturbing. It tempts us with the fantasy of a single-point correction, the belief that enough evil can be traced back to one node in time and cleanly cut away. But real history may not work like that. History may be less like a chain and more like a pressure system. If one point is blocked, the force redistributes. And if that is true, then the moral clarity of the mission begins to blur. This does not mean all outcomes are equal. It does not mean stopping evil is meaningless, but it does mean that changing the past may not produce the neat moral victory we imagine, because every historical figure, no matter how monstrous, is also embedded in a world of causes. And if you truly want to prevent the future, you may need to alter not one person, but an entire civilization, which leads to an even more disturbing possibility. How much of the past would you have to erase before the horror disappears? Would you need to prevent one speech, one book, one failed art career, one war, one economic collapse, one humiliating treaty, one assassination, one political appointment? The deeper you go, the more history begins to resemble a mountain of unstable stones. Remove one, and the shape changes, yes, but not always in ways you can predict. And here the paradox becomes moral as well as causal. Because in trying to save history, you become someone willing to edit it. You take upon yourself the power to decide which lives should occur and which should not. That is not a small thing. Imagine you are standing in the past with the knowledge of what is coming. You know the suffering ahead. You know the camps, the bombings, the famine, the broken generations. You also know that if you intervene deeply enough, millions of people who existed in your original timeline may never be born. Some of those future lives belong to victims. Some belong to survivors. Some belong to ordinary people whose only crime is that they are downstream from events you are trying to undo. So now the question becomes even more difficult. Is preventing one atrocity worth erasing an unknown future full of people who would otherwise have lived? That is a terrible question, and there may be no emotionally satisfying answer. Because time travel turns morality into arithmetic without stable numbers. You are not only weighing lives against lives, you are weighing possible worlds against each other. A world with one horror may become a world with another. A world with fewer dead may become a world with different dead. A world without one dictator may become a world with a different machine of violence assembled from the same historical materials. And perhaps that is what makes this thought experiment so enduring. It exposes the terrifying gap between moral certainty and causal uncertainty. We may know what should not have happened, but we do not know what would have happened instead. This is where the Hitler problem moves beyond history and becomes a broader meditation on evil itself. because it asks whether evil lives primarily inside individuals or inside systems. Is the monster the man, or the conditions that made the man possible? If you believe evil is mostly personal, then time travel offers a seductive answer. Remove the person, remove the horror. But if evil is systemic, then the problem becomes far more frightening, because systems can regenerate, hatred can reassemble, violence can find new faces, the symbols change, the machinery returns. And if that is true, then time travel may not save us from history at all. It may simply reveal how deep history's roots truly are. There is also a quieter, more unsettling layer to this paradox. Because hidden inside the fantasy of going back and stopping the monster is a comforting assumption that we would recognize evil clearly enough, early enough, and courageously enough to intervene. But would we? History is obvious in retrospect. It is not obvious while it is happening. The future dictator is often just an angry speaker in a crowded room, a failed man with strange ideas, a figure many dismiss as too absurd to matter. Catastrophe often begins not with theatrical evil, but with bureaucracy, denial, cowardice, normalization, and small permissions granted one after another until the structure hardens. So perhaps the deepest paradox here is not temporal, it is human. We imagine using time travel to stop the past because we do not trust the present to notice what it is becoming. That is a chilling thought, because it suggests that the fantasy of retroactive heroism may partly be an escape from the burden of present vigilance. It is easier to imagine assassinating history's villain than confronting the subtle social conditions that create villains in the first place. Easier to fantasize about one decisive act than to face the slow work of resisting propaganda, protecting institutions, defending vulnerable people, and noticing early signs of collective moral decay. And perhaps that is the final twist in this paradox. The real lesson of the Hitler problem may not be about time travel at all. It may be about the danger of believing evil can be solved only after it has acquired a name, a uniform, and a place in textbooks. By then, history is already on fire. The true challenge is earlier, quieter, more ambiguous, more ordinary. Still, the thought experiment lingers because it touches something painfully real in us, the longing to go back and stop the irreversible, to stand at the edge of horror before it hardens into fact and say no. To believe that somewhere, in some earlier hour, catastrophe was still fragile enough to be interrupted, memory collapse. There is a hidden assumption inside almost every time travel story. It is so natural that we rarely question it. The assumption is this: if history changes, you will still remember the old version. You go back, alter the past, return to the present, and somehow carry with you a private archive of what the world used to be. You remember the original timeline even though no one else does. You alone retain the vanished reality, the erased friendships, the undone tragedies, the lost futures, the world that no longer exists. At first, this feels narratively convenient, even emotionally necessary. Without memory, how would a traveler know they changed anything at all? But if we take the idea seriously, it creates one of the most disturbing paradoxes in all of time travel. Because memory is not a neutral container, it is part of the self. And if the past changes enough, then the person who remembers the old world may no longer fit inside the new one. This is the paradox of memory collapse. It asks a deeply unsettling question. Can a mind remain coherent if the history that formed it has been erased? Imagine this. A woman travels back in time to prevent a fatal accident that, in the original timeline, killed her brother when they were children. She succeeds. She returns to the present expecting joy, relief, perhaps some strange adjustment, and indeed her brother is alive. But now the rest of her life is wrong. Not wrong in the sense of being broken, but wrong in the sense of being foreign. In the original timeline, Greece shaped her. It determined where she lived, what she studied, whom she loved, what she feared, what she became. In the altered timeline, that grief never happened. Her brother lived. Their family evolved differently. Different schools, different friendships, different choices, different wounds. and yet she still remembers the old version. She remembers a childhood no one else experienced. She remembers a funeral that no longer occurred. She remembers becoming a person this world no longer has room for. This is where the paradox begins to bite. Because memory is not just information about the past, it is the architecture of identity. You are in many ways a pattern of remembered continuity. Your fears make sense because of what you remember. Your loves make sense because of what you remember. Your values, habits, language, reflexes, ambitions, shame, tenderness, and private emotional logic all emerge from accumulated experience. But if history is altered, then that accumulated experience may no longer match the reality around you. And if it does not match reality, what exactly are you? A survivor of a vanished world? A contradiction with a heartbeat? A person whose mind belongs to a timeline that has already been overwritten? There is something deeply lonely about that possibility, to remember what no one else can verify, to grieve what no one else lost, to carry emotional scars from events that in the current universe never happened. Imagine trying to explain your sorrow to someone who has only ever known the corrected version of history. They look at you with concern, perhaps confusion. They tell you your brother has always been alive. They show you photographs, shared holidays, family jokes, years of memories in which he never disappeared. And yet you remember burying him. That is not just confusion. That is psychic fracture, because your memory and your world are no longer aligned. And perhaps that misalignment cannot remain stable forever. That is the deeper terror inside memory collapse. Not only that you might remember too much, but that the mind itself may begin to fail under contradictory timelines. Take a moment to imagine the pressure of holding two childhoods at once. Two incompatible histories. Two sets of emotional truths. In one world, your mother became distant after the loss. In another, she remained warm and whole. In one world, you moved away. In another, you never left. In one world, your life narrowed around grief. In another, it unfolded along an entirely different path. Which one is you? And how long could the mind carry both before something begins to tear? This is not merely a poetic question. Even in ordinary life, memory is fragile enough. It distorts, edits, protects, invents. Human beings already struggle to maintain a coherent story of self across a single uninterrupted life. We forget details, revise motives, reinterpret our past to survive the present. Now imagine adding an actual alternate history on top of that. Not metaphorical contradiction, but literal contradiction. Memories that are emotionally vivid, yet physically impossible. Experiences that shaped your nervous system but no longer belong to any existing chain of events. The result may not be wisdom. It may be collapse. This is where time travel begins to resemble not just physics, but trauma, because trauma, in a very real sense, is often a form of temporal rupture. Something from the past remains alive in the present, even when the surrounding world has moved on. The body remembers what the calendar cannot undo. A person can know intellectually that the danger is over and still feel trapped inside its recurrence. Memory collapse extends that idea into a cosmic register. The traveler becomes traumatized not only by what happened, but by the fact that what happened no longer officially exists. The wound remains. The world denies the injury. And there is something uniquely horrifying in that. A scar with no event. A grief with no death. A fear with no cause. A love rooted in a history no one else remembers. This also raises the fascinating and unsettling question: what does truth even mean if memory and reality diverge? We often treat memory as imperfect but fundamentally subordinate to the world. If the evidence says one thing and memory says another, we are taught to distrust memory. But in time travel, the traveler may be the only one holding the truth of an erased timeline. That means memory becomes not merely private recollection, but historical evidence. A living fossil of a dead reality, and yet it is evidence no one can confirm. So the traveler occupies a strange position. They may be the only honest witness to a world that has been deleted, and because no one else can verify it, they may also appear delusional. There is something heartbreakingly tragic about that. To be right in a way that makes you incomprehensible. To remember truly, but uselessly. To carry the burden of vanished reality with no shared language for it. And perhaps the mind, in order to survive, would begin to adapt. Maybe old memories would fade. Maybe the brain would slowly rewrite itself to match the new timeline. Maybe the original world would become dreamlike, then fragmented, then unreachable. A face you once loved becomes hard to picture. A tragedy that once defined you starts to feel borrowed. A whole vanished life dissolves not because it was false, but because the mind cannot sustain contradiction forever. That is another version of collapse. Not dramatic breakdown, but gradual erasure, a second death. First the timeline disappears, then your memory of it. And with that, the final witness is gone. There is something almost sacred and terrible in that image, a person carrying the last remaining traces of a world until even their own mind can no longer hold it. The universe corrects itself not only outwardly, but inwardly. Reality reasserts its version of events, and the old world, however loved, however painful, however formative, slips beneath the surface. Unprovable, unrecoverable, unsaid. Still, there is a strange beauty in this paradox too, because it reveals how fragile and precious memory truly is. How much of what we call selfhood depends on continuity. How deeply we are made not just of what happens, but of what we are able to keep. Perhaps that is why time travel stories so often rely on memory surviving change. Because without memory there is no moral weight to altering history, no witness, no loss, no comparison, no ache. Memory is what allows a vanished world to continue haunting the present. And if that memory collapses, then the erased timeline does not merely disappear from history. Quantum branches. So far, many of these paradoxes have assumed something quietly terrifying, that there is only one timeline, one history, one fragile thread of events stretching from past to future, vulnerable to contradiction, fracture, and collapse. But there is another possibility. A possibility that does not remove the eeriness of time travel, only transforms it into something far stranger. What if changing the past does not overwrite history at all? What if it simply creates another one? This is the idea behind what we might call quantum branches. Not in the dense language of technical physics, but in plain terms, it is the thought that reality may not be a single road. It may be a forest of roads, a vast and ever-splitting structure of possibilities, where every major divergence creates a new branch of existence rather than destroying the old one. At first, this sounds almost comforting. No more grandfather paradox, no more erased selves, no more logical impossibilities where you prevent your own existence and somehow remain alive to do it. Instead, if you go back and alter something, you do not break your original world. You simply step sideways into another version of it. The old timeline continues, the new one begins. Nothing is contradicted. Everything survives. And yet, if you sit with that idea for more than a moment, it becomes deeply unsettling, because this solution does not eliminate paradox. It multiplies it. Imagine this. You travel back in time to save someone you lost. In your original life, they died young. Their absence shaped everything that followed. The grief stayed with you for decades. It became part of your identity, part of your reason for building the machine that eventually allowed you to return. You succeed. You save them. They live. The future changes, or so it seems, but according to the branching model, you have not repaired your original timeline. You have not erased the death you came from. You have only created a new branch in which the person survives. Somewhere, in another version of reality, the original loss still happened. The grief still exists. The world that wounded you still continues without interruption. And that is where the emotional force of the paradox begins. Because what exactly have you accomplished? You have saved a version of them, but not the one you lost. You have entered a world where they live. But you have not healed the world that made you. This is what makes quantum branches so strange and sorrowful. It offers possibility without restoration. You can create alternatives, but you may never truly undo what already happened in the branch you came from. There is something haunting in that, a kind of cosmic mercy that still refuses closure. The universe allows for rescue, but not replacement. Take a moment to imagine standing in front of someone you loved and lost, now alive again in a new branch of reality. They smile, they speak, they remember a life you never lived with them. They are real, fully real, not an illusion, not a copy in the ordinary sense. A complete person with continuity, memory, and warmth, and yet some quiet part of you knows this is not the one who died. Or perhaps more precisely, this is not the version of them whose loss created you. That is a devastating thought, because it suggests that time travel may allow reunion without true return. A branch can give you someone back, but it cannot remove the fact that you once lived in a world where they were gone. This transforms the paradox from one of logic into one of identity and grief. The question is no longer, can I change the past? The question becomes, which past? And perhaps even more disturbingly, which self? Because if every major divergence creates a new branch, then every version of you that could have existed may in some sense still exist somewhere. There may be a version of you who never left home, a version who made a different career choice, a version who married someone else, a version who died young, a version who became cruel, a version who became kind in ways this life never allowed, a version who never built the time machine at all. Suddenly, identity begins to lose its singularity. You are no longer one continuous self moving through one life. You are one branch among countless others, a local expression of a much larger pattern of possible selves. There is something thrilling in that idea at first. It feels expansive, almost liberating. Every road not taken still exists somewhere. Every lost possibility survives in another branch. No decision fully destroys the alternatives. They simply continue elsewhere. But the comfort does not last, because if all possible versions of you exist, then what gives this version any special weight? Why mourn your mistakes if somewhere else you avoided them? Why celebrate your achievements if somewhere else you failed? Why cling to your identity if it is only one leaf on an infinite tree? This is the darker edge of the branching universe. It can make existence feel less tragic, perhaps, but also less singular. And singularity is part of what gives life its emotional force. We love because this person is here now and not infinitely replaceable. We grieve because this life was this life and no other. We choose because choosing excludes. But in a world of endless branches, exclusion becomes murky. Every possibility may be enacted somewhere, and if that is true, then the meaning of any single path begins to shimmer with uncertainty. This is not to say meaning disappears, only that it becomes stranger, more local, more intimate, more fragile. The branch you inhabit still matters to you because it is the one you feel from the inside. Pain still hurts here. Joy still matters here. Love still unfolds here. But now all of it exists against the backdrop of uncountable alternatives, many of which diverged from your life because of moments so small you would never have noticed them at the time. A missed train, a different word chosen in anger, a hand not held, a door closed 1 second earlier. The tree keeps branching, reality keeps dividing, and every branch contains a world complete enough to believe itself central. There is something dizzying about that. A vast architecture of parallel lives, all equally real from within, all carrying their own memories, regrets, hopes, and irreversibilities. And somewhere among them, time travel becomes less like changing one history and more like crossing between neighboring realities. That may solve certain paradoxes, yes. You can kill your grandfather in one branch without erasing yourself in another. You can save a life without undoing your original motivation. You can meet alternate versions of yourself without collapsing causality. But the price of this solution is existential abundance. Too many selves, too many worlds. Too many unresolved losses continuing elsewhere. The contradiction is solved. The loneliness remains. In fact, perhaps it deepens, because if branches are real, then every choice you make is also a silent farewell to countless versions of your life that continue without you. Not destroyed, not unreal, simply inaccessible. You are always moving deeper into one branch, while others keep unfolding in parallel, carrying versions of your unlived life beyond your reach. There is something almost unbearably beautiful in that. The thought that somewhere right now, another version of you is hearing different music, living in a different room, carrying a different grief, making a different mistake, becoming someone you almost were. And none of you can ever fully meet. Perhaps that is the final paradox of quantum branches. Entropy reversal. There is a quiet law that seems to govern almost everything in our universe. Not a law written on paper, but one written into the feel of existence itself. It is the reason ice melts instead of unmelting, the reason smoke drifts outward instead of gathering itself neatly back into a candle, the reason broken glass does not leap from the floor and rebuild itself into a window, the reason we remember yesterday but not tomorrow. This law is often described through a concept called entropy, but in plain language, entropy is simply the tendency for ordered things to become more disordered over time. Not always dramatically, sometimes very slowly, sometimes invisibly, but always in one direction. A hot cup of tea cools. A room becomes dusty. A body ages. A star burns its fuel. A memory fades. The universe seems to have a preferred arrow. Forward, and if that is true, then time travel does not merely challenge history. It challenges the very direction of physical reality. This is the paradox of entropy reversal. It asks one of the deepest and strangest questions in all of temporal thought. If you travel backward in time, are you also traveling backward through the natural flow of disorder? And if you are not, then what exactly is happening to you? At first, the issue may seem abstract, almost technical, but it becomes unsettling very quickly once you imagine it clearly. Suppose you step into a machine and travel 100 years into the past. You arrive physically intact. Your body still bears its age. Your memories remain in sequence. Your heartbeat continues normally. You are, from your own point of view, moving forward just as you always have. And yet the world around you is now earlier. The room is younger. The air is younger. The people are younger. The entire surrounding reality has shifted backward along the timeline. This means something very strange has happened. You are now moving forward through a world that is, in some sense, behind you. You have carried your own local arrow of time into an earlier chapter of the universe. And that creates a hidden tension. Because the traveler and the environment are no longer fully aligned, your body says one thing, history says another. Your cells continue aging. The world around you has rewound. This may sound manageable at first, but if the arrow of time is not merely psychological, if it is built into the deep physical behavior of matter itself, then time travel may require more than changing your location on a cosmic calendar. It may require violating the very tendency of the universe to move from lower disorder toward higher disorder, and that is no small thing. Take a moment to imagine a simple image. An egg falls from a table and shatters on the floor. We all know what that looks like, but now imagine the reverse. The shell fragments begin to tremble. The liquid gathers inward. The broken pieces leap upward and reassemble in midair until the egg is whole again and rises back onto the table. There is no obvious law of motion preventing this in the narrow mechanical sense. Tiny particles can move in ways that are individually reversible. But in the real world, the combined probability of all those scattered pieces returning to perfect order is so unimaginably small that it effectively never happens. That is entropy, not impossibility in the strictest sense, but overwhelming directional preference. The universe does not forbid reassembly, it simply almost never chooses it. So if time travel to the past is possible, one possibility is that the traveler somehow moves against this directional preference while still remaining internally consistent. And that creates a paradox, because now you have a pocket of forward-moving disorder embedded inside a backward-shifted environment. You are like a flame carried into an earlier page of a book, still burning according to your own sequence while the paper around you belongs to a different chapter. This raises a profoundly eerie question. Would the past even tolerate your presence? Not morally, not causally, physically. Would a forward-moving body in a backward-located world create subtle conflicts in heat flow, decay, chemistry, or probability? Would your mere presence inject future-shaped disorder into an earlier state of reality? Perhaps every footprint you leave is not only a causal disturbance, but a thermodynamic one, a tiny local corruption of the past's original physical balance. That thought is deeply unsettling. It suggests that the traveler is not merely an observer or intruder in history. They are a kind of anomaly in the arrow of time, a being whose internal continuity no longer matches the surrounding age of the universe. There is something almost ghostly about that, a person arriving in the past not only from another era, but from another direction. Still aging, still metabolizing, still remembering. Still carrying the irreversible marks of a future that should not yet exist. And perhaps this is where the paradox becomes existential, rather than merely physical. Because our sense of self depends profoundly on irreversibility, we are creatures shaped by accumulation. We remember what has happened, not what will happen. We carry scars, not anti-scars. We grow older by gathering disorder, not younger by shedding it. The arrow of time is not only in the world around us, it is in us. So if time travel ever truly moved us backward, but left our inner continuity untouched, then we would become deeply out of step with the reality we entered. A consciousness built from irreversible experience, walking through a world that from its own historical standpoint has not yet reached the moments that built that consciousness. That is a very strange kind of loneliness, to know outcomes that the world has not earned yet, to carry grief from events that have not happened, to inhabit a body formed by tomorrows in a landscape still living through yesterdays. The traveler becomes temporally asymmetrical. They belong nowhere cleanly, not fully to the past because they are too advanced in sequence, not fully to the future because they have physically left it behind. And if enough such displacement occurred, perhaps the paradox would deepen further. Could too much reverse travel begin to unravel the ordinary arrow of time locally? Could repeated incursions of future-born matter into the past alter the statistical flow of events, not dramatically but subtly, like introducing a persistent current against a river? Even if not in spectacular ways, the symbolism alone is powerful. Time travel would not simply mean going elsewhere. It would mean carrying irreversibility into places where it does not yet belong. There is something almost tragic in that, because to travel backward would not be to become young again. It would be to remain yourself in a younger world, and that is not the same thing. The fantasy of time travel often hides a longing for restoration, to return, to undo, to revisit life before certain losses or mistakes. But entropy reversal reminds us that return may be physically and emotionally incomplete. You can go back to an earlier year, but you cannot easily go back to an earlier state of being. The cup does not unbreak inside you. The years do not unhappen in your mind. You carry your disorder with you, your memory, your age, your irreversible self. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson hidden inside this paradox. That time is not just where events are arranged. It is the direction in which things become unable to be undone. That is what gives moments their weight. That is what gives life its tenderness. That is what makes regret possible and memory sacred. Without irreversibility, nothing would matter in quite the same way. Light delay. There is a strangely beautiful fact about the universe that most people know, but very few ever truly feel. When you look into the night sky, you are not seeing things as they are. You are seeing them as they were. The moon is a little over 1 second old. The sun is about 8 minutes old. The nearest stars are years old. Some galaxies are millions, even billions of years old by the time their light reaches your eyes. In other words, the cosmos is not presented to us in the present tense. It arrives late. Reality comes to us delayed. And if you sit with that long enough, it begins to feel like a subtle form of time travel already built into ordinary perception. Every act of seeing is, in some small way, an act of looking into the past. This is where the paradox of light delay begins. Because once we understand that all information travels with delay, a disturbing question emerges: is the universe ever truly present to itself? At first, this may sound poetic more than paradoxical, but the deeper you think about it, the stranger it becomes. We tend to imagine the world as happening now, all at once, a synchronized stage where events unfold in a shared present. But the speed of light, the finite speed at which information moves, quietly undermines that picture. Nothing can be seen instantly across distance. No signal arrives without travel time. No event is observed at the exact moment it occurs unless the observer is already there. And even then, the light reflected from the event still takes a tiny fraction of time to reach the eyes. This means that the present is not a clean universal slice through reality. It is more like a patchwork of slightly different pasts stitched together by perception. Your hand, the wall, the horizon, the moon, the stars, all belong to different layers of delayed information. You experience them as simultaneous, but they are not equally current. The world only feels immediate. It is, in truth, a carefully assembled collage of lateness. That alone is eerie enough. But time travel makes the problem more severe, because if all knowledge of the world is delayed, then perhaps many of the paradoxes we imagine about time depend on a false assumption that there is one objective, now, from which the past and future cleanly depart. What if there is no such clean now at all? Imagine two observers very far apart in space. One watches a distant star explode. Another, elsewhere, has not yet received the light from that explosion and still sees the star intact. Which observer is seeing reality correctly? In one sense, both are. The explosion has happened in one frame of reference and has not yet become visible in another. The event exists, but its arrival as information is staggered through space. This means that even without a time machine, the universe already allows different observers to inhabit slightly different informational relationships to the same event. One lives in the aftermath. Another still lives in the before. That is deeply strange. It suggests that the cosmos is not a single synchronized theater, but a vast structure in which when something is depends partly on where you are and how long its evidence takes to reach you. Take a moment to imagine that. Somewhere in the universe, there may be civilizations currently watching light from Earth's distant past. To them, perhaps, our planet still holds dinosaurs, or ancient oceans, or the first sparks of human civilization. They are not seeing fiction. They are seeing a real delayed slice of our history still traveling outward through space. And perhaps elsewhere, if someone is close enough and technologically advanced enough, they may already be watching events from our own future, not because the future has happened for us, but because their relationship to space-time makes the ordering of events profoundly different from our own intuition. This is where the paradox becomes genuinely unsettling. Because if information is delayed, then observation is delayed. Then observation itself becomes a form of temporal displacement. You never see reality directly. You see its surviving signal. You never encounter the event itself, only the evidence of its having occurred some time ago. In that sense, all perception is haunted. Every face you look at is already a tiny memory. Every sunrise is slightly late. Every star is a message from what no longer is. And once you realize that, the universe begins to feel less immediate and more archival, a vast museum of traveling light, a library of delayed existence. Still, the light delay paradox becomes even more disturbing when combined with time travel. Suppose you travel far enough away from Earth, at incredible speed, and then somehow observe the light that left our planet centuries ago. In a certain sense, you could watch the past unfold again, not by changing time, but by intercepting old information still in transit through space. That sounds almost magical at first. A cosmic replay. A chance to watch lost history, to see vanished cities, extinct animals, forgotten faces. But then the paradox sharpens. Because what you are seeing is not the past itself. It is the past's outgoing shadow. A recording written into moving light. You cannot touch it. You cannot enter it. You cannot warn anyone there. You are close enough to witness, but infinitely far from intervention. There is something deeply melancholic in that, to be able to see what has been lost, but never to reach it. To observe a vanished world and remain powerless before it. A perfect metaphor, perhaps, for memory itself. And this reveals something profound about time. The past may not disappear cleanly. It may continue to exist in fragments, not as living reality, but as traveling evidence. As echoes. As photons crossing impossible distances, carrying images of what once was long after the event has ended. The universe, in that sense, is full of ghosts made of light. And perhaps that is why this paradox feels so haunting, because it suggests that reality is never fully present, never fully synchronized, never entirely shared. Each observer lives inside their own shell of incoming information, their own delayed horizon, their own partial version of what the universe is doing. No one sees the whole thing at once. No one ever truly stands in now. We live inside staggered arrivals, and if that is true, then perhaps time travel is not only about machines or paradoxes or impossible loops. Perhaps it begins with something far more ordinary. Looking, waiting, wayseeving, living always just a little behind the events that make the world. There is also a philosophical sadness hidden here. We often long to be fully present, fully here, fully inside the moment, but physics quietly tells us that even presence is layered with delay. By the time something reaches awareness, it has already happened. By the time you know a thing, it has already entered the past. This is not merely cosmic, it is intimate. A smile reaches you after it forms. A word reaches you after it is spoken. A goodbye reaches you after it has already begun to leave. Light delay reminds us that life itself is made of tiny lags between event and awareness, and perhaps that is why so much of existence feels like trying to hold what is already slipping away. Still, there is beauty in this too. The idea that the universe preserves itself in motion, that every moment radiates outward, that nothing simply vanishes but leaves traces traveling onward through darkness. A laugh, a face, a storm, a civilization, a star, all of it becoming visible elsewhere, later to eyes that have not yet looked. Closed timelines. There is a particularly unsettling possibility hidden inside time travel, and it is not the possibility that the past can be changed. It is the possibility that it cannot. Not because time travel is impossible, but because time itself may already include the traveler's actions as part of what always happened. This is the paradox of closed timelines. A world in which the loop is not a mistake, it is the structure. A world in which every attempt to alter history is already woven into the history being altered. Every warning, every intervention, every desperate effort to prevent disaster turns out not to be an intrusion from outside the timeline, but one of the very causes that produced it. At first, this sounds almost elegant, even reassuring. No contradictions, no broken causality, no grandfather paradox, no erased futures. The timeline remains internally consistent because nothing truly changes. Events unfold exactly as they must, including all acts of time travel. But if you sit with that for more than a few moments, it becomes deeply eerie, because it means that freedom may survive only as an illusion. Imagine this. A physicist discovers that a catastrophic laboratory explosion will occur next Tuesday at exactly 3 in the afternoon. Desperate to stop it, she builds a crude machine capable of sending a message 1 week into the past. She writes a clear warning to her earlier self. Do not begin the experiment. The message is sent. Her past self receives it, panicked by the warning. The earlier version changes the setup of the experiment, introducing a safety adjustment she would never otherwise have made, but that exact adjustment turns out to destabilize the system and directly causes the explosion she was trying to prevent. The warning did not stop the disaster. It created it. And yet, because the disaster still occurs, the future physicist still exists to send the warning. The loop closes perfectly. Nothing is contradicted. Nothing is erased. Everything fits. And that is precisely what makes it so disturbing. Because if the timeline is closed, then your attempt to escape fate may be one of the gears inside fate itself. The door you thought you were trying to lock was already waiting for your hand to close it. This is one of the coldest ideas in all of temporal philosophy. That history may be self-sealing, not fragile, not open, but complete, a structure in which every apparent intervention has always already been accounted for. Take a moment to imagine the emotional consequence of that. To spend years trying to save someone, to risk everything, to travel backward, to warn them, to move heaven and earth to prevent their death, only to discover with unbearable clarity that your intervention was always part of the chain that led them there. The very love that made you resist fate becomes one of fate's instruments. That is almost tragic beyond language, and perhaps that is why closed timelines feel so psychologically powerful. They do not merely threaten logic, they threaten the human need to believe that effort matters. Because in a closed timeline, effort still happens, choice still feels real, fear still burns, hope still acts, but all of it may already be enclosed within a pattern that cannot be escaped. The traveler does not break history. The traveler completes it. There is something almost mythic about that, like ancient stories in which a prophecy is fulfilled precisely because someone tries to avoid it. The king hears the warning, hides the child, banishes the witness, seals the gate, and in doing so, brings the prophecy to life. We often think of prophecy as mystical, but closed timelines suggest that prophecy may simply be perfectly self-consistent causality, a future event known in advance not because it is magical, but because every attempt to prevent it belongs to the very chain that ensures it. And that raises a terrifying question. What does free will mean inside a closed timeline? Do you still have choices if every choice you make was always part of the structure? One answer is yes. You still choose. You still deliberate. You still feel uncertainty. The fact that your actions are embedded in a consistent timeline does not necessarily mean you were externally controlled like a puppet. It may simply mean that your freely chosen actions happen to be part of a world whose total shape is fixed. But emotionally, that distinction may offer little comfort. Because from the inside, we do not merely want to choose. We want our choices to be capable of changing outcomes. And closed timelines cast doubt on whether that kind of openness exists at all. You can act, you can resist, you can love, you can fight, but perhaps all of it was already included, already counted, already there. This makes time feel less like a river and more like architecture, not something flowing into existence moment by moment, but something complete from the outside, like a finished structure we are moving through room by room without seeing the whole design. That is a profoundly strange way to imagine reality. It suggests that the future may not be undecided in the way we intuitively believe. It may already exist as part of a larger pattern, even if our limited perspective prevents us from seeing it in advance. And if that is true, then time travel does not create paradox by interfering with history. It reveals that history may have been closed all along. There is also a darker emotional layer here, because closed timelines do not only trap disasters, they also trap redemption. Imagine receiving a letter from your future self saying, "You will make a terrible mistake." Do not say those words. You try to obey. You become cautious, tense, hyper-aware. You overthink every conversation. And in that very state of fear and self-consciousness, you say the exact words you were trying to avoid. The warning folds into the wound. The attempt to avoid the mistake becomes the condition that produces it. This is not just a time travel problem. It feels disturbingly close to human life. How often do we create the thing we fear by orienting ourselves too rigidly around avoiding it? How often does anxiety become the architect of its own prophecy? How often do we tighten so hard against one possible future that we accidentally walk into it? This is why closed timelines resonate beyond science fiction. They mirror something psychologically true. That awareness can become entanglement. That self-consciousness can become causation. That trying too hard to escape a pattern can sometimes deepen the groove. Still, there is a peculiar comfort hidden in this paradox too. A cold comfort, perhaps, but a real one. If the timeline is closed, then perhaps nothing is truly accidental. Not in the sentimental sense that everything happens for a reason, but in the structural sense that events belong to a coherent whole, even when we cannot understand it from the inside. The loss, the warning, the return, the failed rescue, the repeated hour. All of it may fit together in ways too large for one mind to grasp. That idea can feel oppressive, but it can also feel strangely beautiful. A universe so tightly woven that even attempts to tear it become part of its pattern. A cosmos in which causality curls back on itself not as error, but as design. Still, the beauty is severe, because if time is closed, then some doors are not waiting to be changed. They are waiting to be discovered as already shut. And perhaps that is the final sorrow of this paradox, to realize that what felt like intervention was always participation. What felt like rebellion was always fulfillment. What felt like an attempt to rewrite history was only history recognizing itself through you. You do not stand outside the timeline with a pen. You stand inside it with a role, already written, already necessary, already moving toward the moment you thought you were trying to avoid. Identity drift. There is a hidden cost to time travel that rarely receives as much attention as paradoxes, machines, or collapsing universes. It is quieter than those things, more intimate, and perhaps more frightening, because even if time travel were somehow physically possible, and even if history could survive the strain, there would still remain a deeply personal question. What happens to the self when it no longer belongs to one continuous life? This is the paradox of identity drift. Not the sudden contradiction of meeting yourself, not the dramatic crisis of erasing your own birth, but the slow, subtle destabilization that begins when your life is no longer shaped by one coherent sequence of becoming. Ordinary identity depends on continuity. You are who you are not because you remain exactly the same from year to year, but because your changes occur in a traceable order. Childhood becomes adolescence. Adolescence becomes adulthood. One decision leads to another. One loss leads to another adaptation. One love opens into another fear. Even when life is chaotic, the self still grows through a rough continuity of cause and memory. Time travel breaks that continuity, and once continuity breaks, identity may begin to drift. Imagine this. A man in his 40s travels backward 20 years to revisit a single turning point in his life. He intends only to observe, perhaps to alter one small choice, but something goes wrong. He remains there for several years, living inside the younger version of the world he once left behind. At first, he still thinks of himself as a visitor. He remembers his original timeline clearly. He carries his older habits, older griefs, older language. He feels anchored by memory. But as the years pass, something strange begins to happen. He starts forming new relationships in the past, new routines, new emotional attachments, new regrets, new private jokes, new disappointments, new versions of himself. And gradually, the life he came from begins to feel less like home and more like a previous draft of existence. That is where the paradox begins. Because if you spend enough time living inside another branch, another era, another arrangement of causality, then which self remains the real one? The traveler who left or the traveler who stayed? At first, this may seem like a philosophical game, but it becomes far more unsettling when you realize that identity is not stored in a single place. It is distributed across memory, habit, body, relationship, context, and narrative. It is not a solid object you carry unchanged through time. It is a process, a pattern, a continuously updated answer to the question, who am I becoming? But time travel interferes with that process by scrambling the order in which becoming occurs. You might become emotionally older before you are physically older. You might revisit a younger world with an older mind. You might outgrow experiences before you have officially had them. You might mourn events that have not happened yet, love people who have not met you yet, or lose connection with a future self you once assumed was waiting for you. And once that happens, identity no longer feels like a line. It becomes a weather system, shifting, layered, difficult to locate. Take a moment to imagine meeting your younger self, not as a dramatic confrontation, but as an ongoing relationship. At first, perhaps, you feel obvious distance. You are wiser now, more tired, more reflective. You can see all the flaws and naivete in the person you used to be. But then days pass, weeks, months. You talk, you argue, you influence each other, and slowly a disturbing ambiguity emerges. Because the younger self is not merely your past, they are also another person. They have their own interiority, their own immediate hopes, their own private emotional logic that no amount of hindsight can fully dissolve. And now the boundary between self and other begins to blur. Are you mentoring yourself? Competing with yourself? Competing with yourself? Manipulating yourself? Replacing yourself? Or simply watching one version of you split away from the one you became? This is where identity drift becomes deeply eerie, because time travel may reveal that the self is less singular than it feels from the inside. We like to imagine that there is one authentic me stretching through the years, accumulating changes without losing its core. But perhaps that sense of unity depends heavily on the fact that we normally move through time in one direction only. We do not usually revisit prior versions of ourselves as if they were separate lives. We do not usually live in multiple emotional chronologies at once. Time travel would force exactly that. And under those conditions, the self may begin to loosen, not shatter all at once, just drift a little farther from coherence each year, a little less certain which memories define it, a little less able to say where one version ends and another begins. There is something almost melancholy in that image, a person slowly becoming a stranger to their own original life. Not because of trauma alone, though trauma may be involved. Not because of memory failure alone, though memory may blur, but because the self keeps adapting to new temporal conditions until the old narrative no longer holds. You once thought your life was one story. Now it feels like several overlapping drafts, and none of them fit perfectly. This can become even more unsettling if multiple trips occur. Imagine someone who repeatedly moves across decades, altering small events, revisiting old chapters, stepping in and out of branching timelines. After enough temporal displacement, their identity may begin to resemble a collage rather than a line. They remember falling in love in one timeline and never meeting that person in another. They remember grieving a parent in one branch and reconciling with them in another. They remember living in cities they no longer officially moved to. They remember versions of themselves who, in the current reality, never fully existed. At what point does a person carrying that much contradiction stop being a stable self and become something else entirely? A temporal composite, a being assembled from incompatible biographies, a consciousness made of alternate emotional histories, layered one over another like translucent pages. There is something beautiful in that too, perhaps, a richness, a multiplicity, a self expanded beyond the narrow prison of one path. But beauty and stability are not the same thing, and the expanded self may come at a terrible cost. Because identity depends not only on depth, but on orientation. You need to know, at least loosely, where you are in your own becoming. What came before? What follows after? What counts as growth? What counts as repetition? What counts as repetition? What counts as regret? Time travel destabilizes all of that. Suddenly, before and after are no longer simple categories. Emotional age and chronological age may diverge. Memory may not match public history. Personal development may occur out of sequence. You may become wiser in relation to a world that has not yet wounded you, or more broken in relation to a world that thinks you are still whole. This is not just disorienting, it is ontological. It threatens the very structure of selfhood. And perhaps that is the deepest reason identity drift feels so haunting, because it reveals that identity may be less durable than we hope. We are not only who we remember being, we are also who time has allowed us to become in order. Break that order, and the self begins to loosen from its frame. Still, there is one final layer to this paradox. Perhaps the drift is not purely loss. Perhaps it also reveals a truth we usually resist, that there never was one perfectly stable self to begin with. Perhaps we are always already drifting, only more slowly, changing through memory, relationship, grief, desire, and repetition so gradually that we mistake movement for essence. Time travel would simply make that hidden instability visible. It would expose the self not as a statue, but as a current, not fixed, not singular, not final, only passing through form for a while. Consciousness lag. There is a strange possibility hidden inside time travel that has less to do with clocks and more to do with awareness. We often imagine time travel as if the body and the mind would move together, smoothly, like luggage carried on the same train. You step into a machine, disappear from one moment, and arrive in another. The body goes, the consciousness goes, memory goes, identity goes. Everything stays synchronized. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if consciousness does not move through time as neatly as matter does? What if the body can arrive before the mind has fully caught up? Or worse, what if the mind never truly arrives at all? This is the paradox of consciousness lag. It asks a deeply unsettling question. If you move a human being through time, what exactly happens to subjective awareness during the transition? At first, this may sound almost too abstract to be frightening, but the more closely you examine it, the more eerie it becomes. Because consciousness is not a simple object. It is not a suitcase full of thoughts. It is not merely information written somewhere in the brain like text on a page. Consciousness is a living process, a continuous flow of sensation, memory, attention, bodily feeling, perception, and self-modeling unfolding in sequence. It depends not only on structure, but on timing. The brain is not just a thing. It is an activity, and if time travel disrupts that activity, even for an instant, then the continuity of subjective experience may begin to wobble. Imagine this. A woman enters a machine designed to send her 50 years into the future. The machine functions perfectly from the outside. One moment she is standing in the chamber. The next, she is gone. 50 years later, she appears in an identical chamber, physically intact. To every observer, the process seems successful. She survives, her body remains whole, her memories appear largely intact. She speaks, she recognizes herself. And yet inside, something is wrong. She feels as though there is a delay between perception and presence. Sounds reach her a little too late. Faces feel slightly unreal. Her own thoughts seem to echo before becoming fully hers. She remembers entering the machine, but her sense of having arrived feels incomplete, as if some part of awareness is still suspended between moments. This is where the paradox begins. Because how would you even know whether consciousness had made the trip properly? If the person speaks and behaves normally, we would assume continuity survived. But behavior is not proof of subjectivity. A person can seem intact from the outside while feeling profoundly fractured on the inside. And if time travel were possible, perhaps one of its deepest risks would not be visible injury. It would be temporal desynchronization of awareness, a split between physical continuity and felt continuity. There is something deeply chilling about that. To arrive in the future with your body while your inner sense of self remains half-stranded in the past. Not dead, not unconscious, just slightly out of phase with your own existence. Take a moment to imagine the experience of waking each morning with the vague sensation that you are still becoming present, that your awareness trails a fraction behind the world, that everything around you is real, but your contact with it is delayed by some invisible temporal distance. You smile, speak, eat, remember, function. But privately, something is off. You are here, but not all at once. That may sound subtle, but subtle fractures can be devastating when they occur in the structure of consciousness itself. After all, the self depends on timing. The feeling of I am is not merely a collection of facts. It is a synchronization of perception, memory, anticipation, and embodiment. The mind constantly knits together incoming sensory information, stored experience, and immediate prediction into a seamless present. That seamlessness is one of the great illusions of ordinary life. And perhaps time travel would tear holes in that illusion. Perhaps consciousness requires not only a functioning brain, but a continuous unfolding through local time. If that unfolding is interrupted, compressed, displaced, or rerouted, then awareness may not emerge on the other side in quite the same way. This is where the paradox becomes more profound, because if consciousness is fundamentally processual, then transporting the body may not guarantee transporting the subjective stream. You may rebuild the pattern. You may preserve the memory. You may maintain the neural arrangement, but did the same you continue through the jump? Or did something subtler happen? A break so clean that no one, not even you, can prove whether continuity truly survived. That is a terrifying thought, because it means time travel may force us to confront a question we normally avoid. What actually makes consciousness continuous? Is it memory? If so, then a perfect copy with intact memories should count as you. Is it biological persistence? If so, then the same body should be enough. Is it uninterrupted subjective flow? If so, then even a tiny rupture may matter more than we realize. And if we cannot answer that clearly, then every act of temporal displacement becomes existentially ambiguous. You step into the machine believing you will emerge, but perhaps what emerges is only someone who remembers being you. There is something hauntingly quiet about that possibility, not dramatic death, not visible destruction, just a seamless imitation replacing a vanished stream of awareness so perfectly that no one notices the difference. A consciousness interruption hidden beneath continuity of behavior. This is why consciousness lag feels less like a physical paradox and more like a philosophical abyss. Because it suggests that time travel may not simply move a person through time, it may test whether the self is as continuous as it feels. And perhaps it is not. There is also a psychological version of this paradox that does not require machines. Even in ordinary life, many people experience smaller forms of lag. Moments of dissociation, jet lag, trauma, sleep deprivation, deep grief. Periods where the world continues but awareness feels delayed, muffled, not fully synchronized with reality. You move through the day, but some part of you has not yet arrived. That familiar human experience gives this paradox unusual emotional power. Time travel merely intensifies something we already know in quieter forms, that consciousness is fragile, that presence can slip, that the mind can survive while feeling temporarily displaced from itself. And perhaps this is what makes the idea so eerie, because if time travel were ever possible, it might not shatter the universe first. It might simply produce people who return slightly late to their own lives. People whose bodies have crossed the threshold, but whose awareness keeps arriving in delayed waves. People who look normal, speak normally, remember normally, yet privately feel as though they are always half a second behind the moment they inhabit. That is not the loud horror of collapsing stars or paradoxical explosions. It is a softer horror, a more intimate one, the horror of losing perfect access to your own present. Still, there is a strange beauty in this too, the possibility that consciousness is not a fixed point, but a delicate synchronization, a rhythm, a moving act of alignment between body, memory, world, and time. Perhaps what we call the self is less like an object and more like a phase lock, a temporary harmony between many processes unfolding together. And if that is true, then time travel would not merely challenge the body. It would challenge the music, the timing, the inner arrival. Perhaps the most precious thing about ordinary life is not simply that we are alive, but that for brief moments, awareness and world line up cleanly enough to feel like one seamless now. Consciousness lag reminds us how fragile that alignment may be, how easily it could bend, how difficult it might be to restore once broken.